Good morning, everybody, from Birch Aquarium from home. My name is Caitlin, and here with one of our favorites, Delanie, this
Hi,
morning. And we
everyone.
are going to be talking all about tide pools, some of our favorite habitats, and something that's very common to see here in Southern California. So, Delanie, good morning. Can you remind everyone what's your role at Birch Aquarium?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. So I work in education for the aquarium. So a big part of my job is working with people and working with animals. And today we are going to be talking about tide pools, which is a really favorable hobby for people who live in San Diego. And if you're not from San Diego or not near the ocean and you don't know what a tide pool is, we're going to teach you today all about a tide pool and what it is, where you can find them, and what lives in them. So it's going to be a really fun chat.
Super fun. And both Delanie and I have led public tide pooling tours for Birch Aquarium in the past. Unfortunately, we're not able to do the public tide pooling tours right now due to everything that's going on in the world. But we are always so excited to interact with guests in the tide pool habitat because it's a really neat place where you can see unique ocean animals right there on shore. So it's really a place where the ocean is meeting the land and we get to see that intersection and really amazing creatures. So I think we should probably dive in, haha, Delanie, to talk about what is a tide pool and where are they found?
Hmm. So to start with the first part of that question, what is a tide pool? And if those of you want to join in and leave comments and tell us how you would describe a tide pool. I think everyone kind of has their own description based off their own experiences or maybe memories from visiting a tide pool, or you can try to take a guess because as you can see, there's two words here that are very meaningful to what this place is. And if you've been to the beach before, and Caitlin can speak to this, you might notice that you go to the beach at different times of day and the water line will be at different spots during the day. And that very much is because of the tidal pool on the ocean. So if you were to go in maybe the morning, you might see that the water line is really far out and there's lots of sand to walk on. Maybe you'll go later on in the day and you might notice that the water line is really, really high up and there's not much sand to walk on. So this is all due to the tide. And it's this gravitational pull of the ocean that causes the tide to rise and fall. So that is one part that's really, really important to remember when we're talking about tide pools today. And the second one is that word pool. And those of you, summer's coming, you think of a pool, you think of the pool we played in as maybe kids jumping in the water, essentially a hole filled with water, right, Caitlin?
Yes, totally.
That's essentially what makes up this habitat, this place. It's pools of water that are formed because of the changing tide. And this is a really great picture we're looking at here of the different tidal zones, which we're going to be getting into today. Caitlin, do you want to talk about, you talked about it a little bit, but maybe in more detail of where we can actually find tide pools?
Yeah, so you can really find tide pools along any coast that has a rocky habitat. Here in San Diego, we have a mix. We have beautiful sandy beaches, and we have some very sheer, straight up and down cliffs in some places. But in many areas, we have tide pools and that are found in kind of where you can find a lot of rocks jumbled up together. And where you find that rocky habitat is where the water can get caught in the pools. If you think about you're having a day at the beach, in order to catch water, you have to dig a hole in the sand and then the waves kind of wash it away after a little bit. But those rocks provide the structure to catch the water. So in San Diego, especially in La Jolla, we have two different sets of tide pools along La Jolla Shores Beach and up north of Scripps Pier, which is really cool. And actually, we do have a few people chiming in saying that they've experienced tide pools as well. So Amy is chiming in saying she hasn't seen tide pools in 10 years, so she's really excited to see more. And we have a kindergarten class who's here watching to ask their tide pool questions. And I think Ralph got it right on the nose. It's a place where the water is left during low tide. You got that, Ralph.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Really, really important because it's very difficult to explore a tide pool habitat during high tide because you don't have those pools to then explore. And the animals' behaviors are completely different when it's high tide versus the low tide.
Definitely. And so that big change is a big change for the animals that live in this environment. Tide pools are actually a pretty challenging place to live if you think about it, because the water temperature here in San Diego is usually pretty chilly. We have cold water coming down from Alaska. So these animals, when it's high tide and they're covered with water, they might be in water that's 60 degrees or so, maybe a little bit higher than that in the summer, lower than that in the wintertime. But then when the tide goes down into that low tide time of day, they might be in the blasting heat of the sun. And the water, the little pools might warm up because usually a tide pool is pretty shallow. And so these animals have to have a lot of things on their bodies or in their bodies, these adaptations, to help them live in this really challenging environment. If you guys have any other ideas for what makes living in a tide pool challenging, let us know in the comments. I mean, you think maybe a crab can just go inside a house and close the door when there's a storm or anything like that? I don't think so. So there are a bunch of different things. Oh, maybe Miss Kavanaugh's second grade class might have some ideas for what makes it challenging to live in a tide pool. Oh, and we have another question coming in from Stephanie. Stephanie. Stephanie wants to know, are there any tide pools in Canada? Delanie, are there tide pools in Canada?
I'm sure there are.
My answer is
yes.
Definitely. Because there are some places in Canada that have some of the highest tidal ranges, or the tide will go up and come down in the world. So some of those biggest ranges can be found in Canada. And I know that we have some friends, my personal friends, who live up in Vancouver, and there's beautiful tide pooling up on that west coast of Canada as well. So if you got a coast and there's some rocks and you got some tides, I have a feeling tide pools. So as Delanie mentioned, we're going to talk about a bunch of these different animals that we can find in tide pools. We're going to talk about some tide pool organisms and what they need to do to survive. Now, I brought up a word quickly, adaptation. Delanie, can we talk about that word for a second? What is an adaptation?
That word is really important in the science community, because when we're talking about biology and how living things survive, whether that's in the ocean or on land, they have special, maybe a body part. So if we're thinking about a crab having claws, those claws are specifically there to help that animal survive. So it's any kind of body part, or maybe it's a behavior that that animal has that's going to help it survive in its particular habitat. And it's going to help it live in its habitat in order to get shelter, or to find food, to find water. Those are really important things for any living organism on our planet. So today, when we are exploring these ocean animals that live in tide pools, really look at the body and think about what adaptations does that animal have to help it live in a tide pool. And, could you take these tide pool animals and place them in another part of the ocean? Would they survive there? We'll talk about that today too, because these are animals that Caitlin mentioned. They are very well adapted to living in a tide pool, which is sometimes a really hard habitat to live in for these animals, because it's constantly changing. The high tide's moving up, the low tide's moving out. Imagine if you were an ocean animal and you had to, every single day, just adapt and move around based on where the water line was. So we're going to talk about that definitely when we look at these animals.
For sure. So let's head over and take a quick look at a tide pool here in San Diego. So this is a little tide pool, but it's a great example of what you might find if you're exploring the Rocky Shore in Southern California. And so you can see there's some water caught in the tide pool. It looks like there's some green stuff around it. What's that green stuff, Delanie?
Yeah, so some of you, if you've been to a tide pool, you might know that you need to be really careful when you are walking into a tide pool for many, many reasons, but for that specifically, because it's algae. So we, of course, think of the animals when we're talking about this beautiful tide pool habitat, but the amount of algae that grows in a tide pool is something that also makes it really, really unique. There's many different species of algae that grow, and you'll see different colors. The bright green algae we can see in this photo. There's red algae that grows that kind of looks like lace, like the fabric of lace. And there's brown algae that will grow on the sides, and sometimes big brown algae like giant kelp will wash in. So you can imagine that, of course, these animals probably interact with the algae for protection or maybe for food. But this photo is definitely what a lot of people might recognize if they've been to a tide pool. And you might notice that you might need to take some time to really observe, and you might start noticing things that you might not have if you just walked past it at a tide pool.
Definitely. And something that's one of my favorite things when we bring people to explore tide pools with our Birch Aquarium naturalists is that people at first glance have no idea how many things are alive when they're looking at the tide pool. And so for you or me, we can look at this and start identifying all sorts of animals. But for many people, it's like, oh, it just looks like some algae by a rock. So I really hope by the end of our talk, you'll be able to glance at a tide pool and be like, oh man, I'm spotting lots of creatures. So are you guys ready to talk about one of our first ones? I actually can see a few of them in this photo, but one of our very first animals that we are going to talk about is the green anemone.
Ooh, I love this animal in particular because as a child, you know, when I had a chance to visit a tide pool for the first time, this is the first animal I noticed because it's very easy to spot. They're typically not found in deep water when you go to explore a tide pool. They're typically found in what we call the splash zone. So talking about the different zones of a tide pool, not all the animals are going to be found or concentrated in one zone. There's what we call zonation in a tide pool habitat. And the green anemone are going to be an animal that you might find in what we would call the splash zone, which means they might be high up on those rocks that are sometimes above water. And this is a really interesting photo because you see that bright green color of the anemone. You see it open. And then we also notice two other anemones in here that have a bunch of stuff stuck to them.
This is my favorite thing that anemones do. So we were talking about adaptations or things that animals can do or have in their bodies to help them survive. And what anemones will in tide pools, not all anemones, there are many different types that live in the ocean realm, but the tide pool anemones, what they will do is they will actually grab little pieces of shells and sand and small rocks. To me, from observing them, I think they like to grab the flat pieces of shells. You can actually see some in this picture here on the anemone at the very bottom. It's kind of closed up. And what they'll do is they'll stick those bits of shell kind of on the outside. So when they close up during low or high tide, when they close up, when the water goes down, they are protected. So Delanie, why do these guys want to have shells on the outside of their body when it's low tide?
Yeah, well, you can imagine during low tide, they're exposed to sunlight and they're not in the water anymore. So that sunlight is something that they want to protect themselves from. And this is a really soft, squishy bodied animal. And so it doesn't have a hard shell to protect itself. It can't get up and walk into the water. It sticks and grows on hard surfaces. And so it uses these shells, these coverings to protect itself from getting burned from sunlight. And that's a really important adaptation. An adaptation isn't just body parts, it's also behaviors. This is a behavior of a green anemone that by collecting these hard, flat shells to place on its sticky body, it's going to protect it from some of that sunlight. So when you're exploring a tide pool, you actually might not even notice these animals. So it might also be a way for them to kind of camouflage and hide themselves.
Definitely.
That one picture you can see it, you can tell it's an anemone, but the two on the side of that bright green one, it sometimes you don't know what it is. It's hard
Definitely. Let's see. We had a really great comment from Jessica, who's 7. Hi, Jessica. Jessica says it kind of looks like a big green eyeball.
It does. It looks like an eyeball, probably because of that circle in the middle.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, that is its mouth. So this animal is really interesting because it's got those tentacles that it uses to grab food and then brings it to that center point, which is its mouth. And just like that, see, imagine if you have just like that. do hands-free, do some other things.
Definitely.
They're related to jellyfish. So think of it sort of as an upside down jellyfish.
Definitely. They're so cool. And I think a lot of people might have spotted them in the surrounding area in Southern California, but anemones are very common. So they're found up the entire west coast of the US. And I grew up in Connecticut, and though we didn't have these big green anemones because they can get pretty big, we do have other types of anemones that are found on the East Coast as well. If you are going to be someone who visits a tide pool, and we're going to talk about some steps to take when you visit tide pools a little bit later on, to me, sometimes they look like a little donut with shell sprinkles on top. So if you see something at low tide that looks like a sprinkled donut covered in shells, it's probably a green anemone. Very cool. Should we jump to the next one, Delanie?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. I'm very excited. This is my favorite animal we're going to talk about. Very cool. What animal is this? All right, guys, it looks like it's a chitin. Chitins are super cool. They are actually a type of mollusk. How are we doing, Delanie? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I'm just cutting out a little bit, trying to.
Okay, no worries. Sorry, guys. We're all working with our home internet these days. So no worries. So I'll keep telling people about chitins, which is a good thing because I can talk about chitins till I'm blue in the face. They're actually related to snails and limpets. If anybody's ever seen a limpet, it's kind of like a snail body with just kind of like a half circle of a shell that sticks on. And if you look closely, if you guys look closely, can you see that there are 8 parts of a chitin's shell? Kind of each one of those, it's kind of like a chainmail shell, which is really cool. And they have a soft body underneath them. Now, one of the things I love about chitins is that they've been around for a very long time, more than 500 million years. That is longer than the dinosaurs have been around. That's longer than sharks were even in the ocean or bony fish. And it's even longer than jellies. Jellies haven't even been around that long. So one of the cool things about chitins is also the fact that scientists are still learning a lot about them. Chitins, a lot of them are small, about the size of your thumb, and during the day, they will suction hard onto the rocks, and they will let themselves stick on there to try to conserve water and so that they don't get dried out from the sun. But then when the tide comes up, or if it's evening time and it's a little bit less dangerous for them, they will leave their home spot on the rock and they will graze on all of the different algae around them. But here's the thing. They are not able to just kind of go willy-nilly and live wherever they want. They always come back to their very same spot on the rock and suction down so that they can go ahead and stay safe during that time when the tide is low again. So scientists still don't understand how the chitins are able to navigate around and find their way back to their home. So if there's any young scientists out there who are really interested in a very cool mollusk, I highly recommend taking a look at chitins because they've been around for a long time. We have fossil records of them. And there's still so much to learn about these cool animals. Let's see. Katie says, a chitin looks like a shell with teeth. It does kind of look like it has teeth on top. But the chitins, they don't have actual teeth like you or I have. Instead, like other snails, they have something called a radula. And if anybody has a cat, you might have noticed that when they lick you, their tongue is very kind of scratchy. And that scratchy tongue is is like what a snail has, which is the radula. So the snails use that radula to kind of scrape and lick the algae off the rocks. How cool. Let's see. Oh, we have a lot of comments coming in. Jill is saying there are lots of these in the Pacific Northwest. Super cool. Definitely a lot. Oh, and somebody wants to know, does it bite? Nope. That is a great question because you never know. So if you have never met a lot of these animals before, then it's a very legitimate question. So these guys, if they do end up being popped off the rock, maybe a really big wave or something like that knocks into them, then what happens is they will actually curl up into a ball. So those bony plates are on the outside and they'll kind of tumble along the seafloor until they can find something to stick onto again, which is really, really fun. It's kind of like an armadillo or those roly-poly or pill bugs that you find. Though they're not related to either one of those, it's the same type of adaptation or way that they survive. Very fun. Let's see, we're gonna move on to the next animal while we're waiting for Delanie to come back. This is one that I think many of you guys have probably seen or looked for when you're exploring tide pools. So this is a little shore crab. There are many different types of shore crabs that you can find. There are some purple ones, there's some striped shore crabs. There are some that have very elaborate coloration on them, but shore crabs is a very common name for lots of the different crabs that you can find in local tide pools. Now, shore crabs, they have two big claws that they use both for defense, because nobody wants to get pinched by them. They also use them as a display. So the male crabs will show off his really big claws to the lady crabs to show them that I'm a big male and you should come hang out with me. But then they will also use them in more delicate ways to actually grab food and bring it to their little mouth parts. So on this crab, if you look closely, you see its two claws sticking out there. And then if you look, it has two little eyes. And then underneath its eyes in the middle is that crab's mouth. And so the crabs in the tide pool habitat, they will be found moving around both in the water, but they also have very pointy little feet on the bottoms of their legs. I guess it's technically crabs don't have feet, but where their feet would be are little points, and they actually use those to climb up and down on the rocks. And let's see, Kim says she's seen a bunch of these in Del Mar here in San Diego, and we actually see them all over the place. Now, these little crabs, they are one of the quickest moving animals in the tide pools. We talked about the chitin just now. It's related to snails. It's really slow, but these little crabs can scurry very quickly. So if you go visit a tide pool, exhibiting patience is a great thing, and kind of sitting and looking and observing the tide pool. You might see these little crabs scurry away, but then you actually, if you're very quiet, will see them come back out and you can see them do very cool behaviors. One of the reasons these crabs can be so skittish and run away is because they make an excellent snack for many different predators. Does anybody have any guesses for some of the predators or animals that like to eat other animals in the tide pools? You guys list a few in there in the comments and let me know what you think, but I'm gonna tell you one that people don't often think of, and that is seagulls. People think seagulls are just flying around looking for French fries and hot dogs, but believe it or not, they are actually a top coastal predator. And these seagulls will peruse the beach. And if there happens to be some people with French fries, they may stop and say hello. But they also naturally feed on many different tide pool animals. So, oh yeah, we have a lot of people coming in saying birds. So yes, these birds are going to be able to come down and swoop their food out of those tide pools. So crabs, they're going to want to move very quickly and hide if they see any shadows from a bird coming over. Oh, Victoria says, Hudson says dogs are another tide pool predator. Actually, in places where there are stray dogs and stray cats, they will wander down into the tide pools. And so that is a very good thing to mention. Yes, invasive animals or animals that are brought there by people are not always best for tide pool animals. These are really great guesses, you guys. Let's see, we're gonna move on to our next tide pool animal. What could it be? Guys, I know I said the chitin was my favorite. Oh, Delanie's back. Hi, Delanie. Yay. Guys, thank you for your patience. We have home internet and working on all this stuff, so we're happy that we're able to chime in with you guys. And I'm happy to have Delanie back.
We're back to a weird animal.
Yes, so we just talked about crabs and we talked about how seagulls are one of the top predators in the tide pools. And so now we're moving on to the Navin Act, which is probably one of the hardest animal names to say. It's pronounced Navin Act. And a lot of people think this is a true nudibranch, which is a colorful sea slug that has naked gills. That's why they're called nudibranchs. But Delanie, is this technically a nudibranch?
No, it is not technically. It's a type of sea slug, but they're unique in that they are carnivorous sea slugs, which is very unique because most sea slugs you imagine are nudibranchs. They eat algae, so they're not going after other animals. But this one in particular, it is actually known as a predator of the tide pool, which is really interesting because other sea slugs like to graze or feed on algae that grow in the tide pools, but not the Navin Act. This one I've seen many times hunting or, predating on other animals in the tide pool. And since it is a soft-bodied animal, it actually likes to feed on other soft-bodied animals.
Definitely. And so Navin Acts, they can actually get a lot bigger than people think. Most sea slugs are pretty small, but a Navin Act can be, like about this big. What? This camera is reversed. Like about this big. They can be about 4 inches, maybe about that size. So they are easy to find once you know what to look for. And what's also really cool is that Navin Acts will often travel in groups. So if you see one Navin Act crawling around the tide pool, keep an eye out because you might find another one. And sometimes people think it might be mating pairs that will kind of travel together. But not all the time, a lot of the time. But Delanie, can you tell us, why does the Navin Act have such cool colors?
Yeah, so in nature, there's different colorations to different animals. And of course, they're going to mean different things. Some animals have colors to help them camouflage with their environment, but some animals have colors as a warning color. So seeing these bright kind of yellow and blue neon colors tells other animals it's a warning to kind of stay away from me. And you might notice there's other brightly colored animals in a tide pool that those warning colors could mean the same thing. And you might think, I know some of us have been commenting in the comments here that they have amazing color and how bright and vivid, but these can actually be difficult to spot in a tide pool. And maybe Caitlin from experience too, just because of those bright colors doesn't mean that it's that obvious to see right away. There's a lot of colors in a tide pool. So they're not as noticeable to us, but to other animals, they're going to notice that bright yellow or that bright blue coming near them.
Definitely. Also, the stripes play a big role in the way that they look as well. So if you think about animals that have stripes on the land, maybe like a zebra or an okapi has some stripes on its bottom. Those are a few animals that use stripes to help break up their outline, to help confuse a predator. And so a lot of the times animals will have stripes on their body. And here we have a black body with white stripes on it to help break out the outline of it as well. And so the Navin Act, it has the warning colors of the bright kind of purplish blue and yellow, but then it also has this disruptive color pattern or these stripes to help break up the way it looks in the tide pools. So that's great for when they're on the hunt, when they're a predator. If you think a tiger has stripes to help it blend in, look at this Navin Act. It has so many different cool adaptations to help it survive. Let's see. Kim has a good question. Can you touch them? I would not recommend it.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about this, tide pooling etiquette, what to do when you go tide pooling, but it's really important to use your other senses for observing these animals. Touching something like a Navin Act, you imagine our size of a human, touching something that has no bones that is this big or this small, it can be really detrimental to them. So it's really important to utilize our other senses, our eyes, our sense of smell, our sense of just hearing, and what sounds can you hear in a tide pool. So that's what we encourage you to do, is to really avoid touching these animals, but to observe them. And sometimes you might see behaviors that you wouldn't otherwise notice. But
Definitely.
Especially soft-bodied animals like a Navin Act, they are very, very sensitive to touch.
Yeah, please don't touch. And you also never know if you are going to have a reaction to them as well. So it's for everybody's safety.
Mhm.
Let's see. Landon, who is a kindergartner, wants to know how many types of nudibranch live on the San Diego coast. Now, this is a really great question, Landon, because honestly, I think scientists might still be trying to figure out the answer to this question.
Yeah, you can imagine nudibranchs come in all shapes and sizes. And so we probably haven't even discovered all the species of nudibranchs that live on San Diego's coastline. Um, so that's a really good question. But
Yeah. And nudibranchs also can be found, and again, guys, nudibranchs are related to sea slugs. They tend to be a little bit smaller than our friend the Navin Act, who's a true sea slug. And nudibranchs, I can think of maybe 5 to 10 species off the top of my head that can be found in our local tide pools, but then also in the kelp forest habitat. Anyone who's tuned in for Kelp Cam will have seen that. But I think there are many more than that. And I think that's a great thing for us to try to figure out. And I think scientists still have a lot to learn about those creatures. All right, Delanie, are you ready to check out our next creature?
yes.
Yeah, let's take a look. Oh, another squishy one.
Another absolute favorite of mine. I get so giddy and like a little kid again when I see sea hares in a tide pool. If you look at this animal right away, my best description for it is it's like a giant snail without its shell. That's essentially what all sea slugs are like. But this one in particular, the California sea hare, it's a little bit of a different shape than our Navin Acts and a little bit different of size too. These animals are really soft-bodied, and you might find them kind of in the high tide zone to medium tide zone, meaning they like to be submerged in water, but it doesn't mean they can't be out of water for short periods of time. And you might notice it's sort of like a hare or rabbit, kind of has those little ears sticking out.
Yeah, they're under California's. Its face is on the left-hand side.
And they come in many colors. There's many different species of sea hares that live on our coast, but the California sea hare in particular, beautiful red color, kind of has those, sometimes can look purple, it has little spots on it. And believe it or not, Caitlin, how big can these sea hares get?
Guys, we usually find sea hares that are smaller. Usually a big one is about this big, but I've told people I found one before. I swear it was the size of like a Michael Jordan shoe. It was like the biggest sea hare, and I squealed like a child and was like, look at how big this cool sea hare is. They're really, really amazing. And one of the reasons they can get so big is because they eat a very plentiful food in the tide pools. So Delanie, what are these guys chowing down on?
Yeah, they love a particular kind of green algae called sea lettuce. So if you go to a tide pool, you might notice sort of a bright neon green colored algae growing on the rocks. It literally looks like lettuce. And that's what these animals love to munch on.
It's so cool.
Lettuce. And what's really fascinating is sometimes you find them kind of solitary, like the one in this picture here. But many times when we've taken our guests on our public tide pooling adventures, we find them in the springtime grouped together. I've seen 5 to 10 of these sea hares grouped together, mating, and they lay eggs. And so you might not find a sea hare, but sometimes you can find their eggs, which look like squiggly brains is the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
Pink and look like a ball of a brain. And it's really fascinating. And you'll find them maybe hidden under some algae around rocks, really, really protected. And it's really important to, when you see it, you will know. So just observe and look at them because they went through a lot of work to lay those eggs. So it's really important to make sure you leave them where they are and to just observe them because they're really hard to miss once you spot them.
Definitely. And I think that finding a lot of these animals is training your eyes. I know I mentioned it before, but it's practice looking. I think that people don't always realize that you have to practice finding things. It's kind of like I feel like I'm aging myself, but I loved those Where's Waldo books when I was a little kid. And so the first few times you're trying to find Waldo, you're like, this is impossible. But then by the end of the book, you get really good at it because you're training your brain to look. And essentially, science is kind of like the same thing. You're training your brain, but instead of looking for Waldo, you're training it to observe the natural world around you. And once you kind of get an idea for it, it'll be a lot easier. For example, like if I was looking at for sea hares and I saw a tide pool that was really big and open, I wouldn't look in the big open parts for this creature because, like Delanie said, I know that it likes to eat sea lettuce. I know that it has a soft and squishy body. So it probably doesn't want to be out and about, just kind of in the sun, basking out in the rays. It's probably closer to where its food would be, and it probably wants to hide because it doesn't have a shell or anything to protect itself. So I would look near the edges of a tide pool, kind of around where you might see its food and a place for it to feel protected.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
I think this is a really good model species for talking about a big misconception when people visit tide pools is if they see an animal out of water, they think, I have to put it back in the water. You're doing more harm than good by touching and grabbing that animal, trying to get it back in the water. These animals, like we said, are adapted to living in a tide pool habitat, which means that if you see a sea hare curled up in just the tiniest little pool of water, it's okay because it's adapted to that. It knows how to survive in small pools of water for short periods of time. And sooner or later, with the tidal changes in a day, that water is going to come back up and it's going to be fine again. So that's something that I feel like I've observed quite a bit when going tide pooling is people want to kind of save the animals and help them out. But remember, they're survivors themselves. They know how to live in these tide pools better than we do.
They're super tough. I cannot even imagine. We had some big storms here in San Diego in the spring. We had some big rain storms and wind moving in. So these little sea hares, even though they're soft and squishy and cute, they hunker down, they find a place under a rock, and they make it through. So as we mentioned, tide pools are a challenging place to live, but the animals who live there are tough. Now, I don't want to make it seem like this sea hare is totally helpless. They do have a pretty crazy adaptation that they do for if they are panicked or scared by a predator. And Delanie, what do they do if a predator comes over and grabs them?
Yeah, what they will do is they will eject a dark purple ink into the water, kind of like an octopus.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
It is. And it's very pigmented, very, very dark. And just like another animal, like an octopus might use it for, it would be similar reasons a sea hare would use it for. It's to be able to disrupt the water in order to hide and to be able to get away. And you can imagine it probably doesn't have a good taste in the water or smell either if you're another animal coming after it. And it's very pigmented. I said
Definitely. It's super duper purple. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, and then when it gets kind of diluted a little bit, it'll look almost pink as well. So they have a very startling ink color. That's for sure. All right, guys. Well, we have maybe about 10 minutes more. So Delanie and I are going to go through, we have a few more slides. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but we're going to pick a few more animals that I know that people love to talk about. And I really want to talk about the sea star because somebody mentioned earlier up in the comments, we have so many comments, guys. Thank you for writing in. We're trying to talk as many as we can, but about sea stars. And now for anybody who's lived in San Diego for a long period of time, you might realize that or notice that we used to see a lot more sea stars along our coast, not just ochre stars like these beautiful ones, but bat stars, which kind of looks like they have webbing between their arms, and a few other species. So Delanie, is there a reason why we're seeing fewer sea stars these days than we have in the past?
Yeah, so sea stars are sensitive to temperature changes of the water. And so in recent years, with increased coastal temperature of the water, it's actually sort of ignited what we call the sea star wasting disease. So these sea stars, unfortunately, are succumbed to a wasting disease where their bodies start to break down and they just cannot survive in certain temperatures. And this is something that has been studied by scientists at Scripps Institution of Oceanography many, many years in order to really understand and measure the populations of these different species. Like Caitlin said, the ochre sea star, bat sea stars were highly affected by the sea star wasting disease. We have other species known as like the knobby sea star. So you might go tide pooling and we really don't notice these many sea star species anymore. So scientists are still trying to measure populations and understand how and if the populations are even bouncing back, because our coastal temperatures are still fluctuating. They're still changing even today.
Definitely. And these animals, they have evolved to live in these tide pools. They're very hardy, but unfortunately, with the speed of climate change happening, these coastal environments are very impacted. So sea stars are something that we can see that impact just over the last like 5-10 years. So it's very, very fascinating. Even at Birch Aquarium, we had to do our best to help protect our sea stars during that time, and we did medical treatments to help keep our sea stars as healthy as we possibly could when the changes were going on in the ocean and the sea star wasting disease was at its highest. So, Jill has a great question. How can we help these sea stars?
That's a great question. It can be as simple as what we're talking about today. And if you choose to explore these animals in nature, so whether that's by going tide pooling or if you're scuba diving or snorkeling, it's making sure that you're not disrupting their normal patterns of behavior. So not picking them up, not touching them. Really, if you happen to come across one in the wild, it's just observing from afar. And really what we can do for the bigger picture is to just understand our impacts on climate. It comes down to sometimes simple individual approaches to that, or even on a community level, a state level, a world level of what is your impact on our climate and what is your contribution to it. We want to have a positive impact. We want to try to reduce our carbon footprint. All of that over time can have a positive influence on climate. And then from that, we can hopefully try to positively influence our oceans and reduce that speed of temperatures increasing, loss of habitats. It's all connected. It's all kind of weaved in together. So thinking about your individual contributions and the actions you can take is really, really important.
Another thing that is a great way to help these animals is the creation of marine protected areas. I know we've talked about marine protected areas a few times on these chats, but it's particularly important for tide pools because they are one of those ocean habitats that people can access very easily. And so by creating a marine protected area, the tide pools in La Jolla, or if you are here in San Diego, the beautiful tide pools that are at Cabrillo National Monument down in Point Loma are also protected within a marine protected area. These essentially marine parks or ocean parks are a place where these animals have other pressures like hunting or boat traffic taken away so that they can hopefully survive and adapt to some of those other challenges like climate change that are coming in. So if you guys are ever going to visit a tide pool, it is a really, truly amazing experience, but there are some very important things for you to keep in mind, especially since many of them are within these marine protected areas, and there's probably a fine if you don't obey the rules. But we also want to make sure that we're not harming any animals with our curiosity. So we're going to just go through a few points and tips and tricks. So I know I have a few of my favorite tips and tricks for looking for tide pool animals, and I know Delanie's going to pepper a few in there. So the first thing we want to tell you guys is really make sure you're respecting the animals and their habitat. That means that you are not allowed to take any animals or plants, algae, excuse me, or shells out of the habitat. We didn't talk about hermit crabs, but they're a big one. If you take a little shell, you might be taking a hermit crab's home. And then also making sure not taking anything also means trying not to disturb the habitat. So imagine I was sitting here in my house and all of a sudden a giant came over and ripped the roof off of my house and said, "What's in there?" That's kind of what it's like if you are flipping over rocks inside of a tide pool. So respecting the animals and the habitat doesn't just mean don't take anything. It also means try not to disturb them. Don't lift things up. Don't move things from place to place. Just try to be respectful and say, would you like it if somebody ripped the roof off of your house? Probably not. What else can we do, Delanie?
That's important to remember. And with that, also thinking about your safety and how you're interacting with the tide pool habitat. And, when you're going into a tide pool and entering a tide pool, understanding that there might be animals you can't necessarily see right away. So being very, very cautious of where you choose to step. You could be stepping on a small little colony of barnacles growing on that rock. You could be stepping on sea lettuce, which is the food for sea hares. So just being very, very cautious of what your movements are, and making sure that you're taking your time, because it can be very slippery, very wet, which can turn to be not good for us, right? If you slip and fall. So making sure you're being really, really careful. And depending on, and I know we had a question earlier about this, when is the best time to go tide pooling? Really, in the winter and spring is when we get our lowest low tides. So those are the prime times of year to go tide pooling, because that's when these pools are exposed. In the summer and the fall, those low tides are not quite as low, so this habitat isn't as exposed for exploring for our eyes. But with that, you want to be really cautious and always make sure you have your eyes to the ocean, because those waves can come up out of nowhere and wash you out under your feet. So
it would not be the first time that had happened to either one of us. So definitely keep an eye on the water for sure.
Yeah.
Another thing is, Delanie has brought this up a few times, but is to be patient. And that means, I think it ties in with using your senses to observe. Walk and tread carefully where you're going, be patient. And then also, a lot of animals, as I mentioned with those little shore crabs, as soon as they see something, they're going to hide. So by kind of staying still and using your science eyeballs and your science senses, you'll be able to see more animals. And my biggest tip that I always give people tide pooling is that, do you remember one of the top predators in the tide pool is going to be a bird? And usually the first thing that these tide pool animals see if a bird is coming down is the shadow. So try to approach a tide pool with your shadow behind you. That way, your shadow is not scaring the animals before you get a chance to actually see them. So being aware of where the light is and where your shadow is falling is a great way to have a better chance of trying to see some of these animals that love to hide. So patience, patience. We're all very zen when we see a tide pool.
Definitely. And another one we have listed here is conserve and inspire. So a way for you to conserve is just to keep in mind all the things we talked about today. So minimizing your contact and your engagement with these animals by not touching, not picking things up, not disrupting them, using your other senses to observe, using your sense of sight, your sense of smell, your sense of hearing is going to be really important. And inspire others, being able to learn and understand these tide pooling tips and what kind of animals you can see, and teaching those around you and encouraging others to practice these same tide pooling etiquette tips that we're providing you, to make sure that we're all doing our due diligence to help these animals out and make sure we're protecting them and keeping them living a long, long time, because they already have enough to survive against living in a tide pool. So we don't want to add any more stress to these animals' lives by exploring a tide pool habitat.
Definitely. And at the same time, we don't want to add more stress to our own lives. So we wanted to make sure you guys don't forget, if you're visiting a tide pool, please wear shoes. I've seen so many people walking around in the tide pools in bare feet, and this is a terrible idea because there are a lot of sharp things and a lot of slippery things. So usually we recommend people wear like a sport sandal that has some grip to it, like some Tevas or something like that, or even some sort of boots that are waterproof. And then also make sure you wear sun protection, because if you're looking down in a tide pool, the back of your neck and actually the backs of your legs get really sunburned very easily. So just make sure you're taking those types of precautions to protect yourself while you're taking all of these other steps to respect the animals and check out this really amazing habitat where you can see so many ocean creatures where the land meets the sea. It's so cool. And I hope that you guys, I know there are lots of different rules and restrictions that we all have right now, but making appropriate decisions and safe steps to explore local tide pool habitats may be something that's allowed in some of your communities. So please check your local regulations for who is allowed out right now, but then also double check your marine protected area regulations, see if this area is protected. And if it is or it isn't, just make sure you're not taking any animals, not stepping on anybody, and having a great time, because it really is a very fun place to explore, whether you're 3 years old or, older. So it's really fun, and I love going down there. So Delanie, do you have anything you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
Just thanks everyone for joining us. There were so many questions we couldn't get to.
So many.
Appreciate your engagement, and take the time to try to explore the answers to your questions on your own. And like Caitlin said, if you have the opportunity to go outside and practice this hobby of tide pooling at any point in the future, just to keep these things in mind and know that some of the best memories in San Diego, I feel, can be created from tide pooling. And when the aquarium eventually reopens and we're able to welcome guests through our doors, we also have our amazing tide pool plaza that overlooks tide pools, which happen to be a part of a marine protected area. So we encourage you to come in and visit us when we do open our doors, and look at tide pools in our tide pool plaza habitat as well. So
yeah, that's a great way to kind of learn everything ahead of time and become an expert. And then you take your friends down to the tide pool and you're like, oh, that's a chitin. So you come to the aquarium, we'll tell you everything, and then you can share your friends. And that is conserving and inspiring others to enjoy the ocean world. So thank you guys so much. We'll have another live broadcast Thursday at 2, and hopefully some of you guys can tune in. Thank you. Have a great one.
bye.
Bye.